Well, thank you very much, Fazana, for that introduction. Thank you. It's a great pleasure to have you here this afternoon. Thank you very much for coming along. This is room 101 for today. For those of you that don't know, my name is Wyn Morgan, Pro Vice Chancellor for Learning and Teaching. It's my great pleasure to host this edition of Room 101. So whilst the clock has not struck 13, it's struck 13:30. And whilst you don't have Winston Smith, you have Wyn instead. It's going to be our version of Room 101. So it's a great pleasure to have you here for this. So can I just click and it will go? Yeah, thanks.
You can talk.
I can talk. I can do that bit. Yeah, that's all right. So Fazana's just going to set up the presentation for this session. But just before we do that, just a couple of slides I want to go through first. Because basically what this is all about, obviously we're into the first day of the TELFest. And it's a great pleasure to have you all here. TELFest is now a regular feature along the calendar for learning and teaching. And it's great that you're here to support this session, but hopefully be part of the sessions during the week as well. Because really what TELFest is about is a number of things. But first of all, I've got to do the advert, and that's the app. So hopefully most of you carrying smart devices and smartphones, if you can download the app, then you can get involved in the TELFest while you're here and indeed while you're remote. So if you haven't done this yet, do download the TELFest app, available from all good app stores for free. You can keep up to date, does allow you to interact with the sessions. It puts you in contact with other people and gives you delegate lists, etc. So do please download that. It also allows you to play some of the games that we've got going during the course of the week. So we've got things like the scavenger hunt, we've got things like the completing missions, so you'll be set out on missions, not Mission Impossible I hasten to say, but you'll be set out on missions to complete, so do get involved in those. It is a chance to talk to each other beyond the physical environment in which you're going to, come on Greg, and indeed to support networking, so do please do that. Search for TELFest and the password is Diamond, okay, so that's one to how appropriate to use for this particular session, okay. So TELFest is really about getting people together just to talk about the use of technologies to support learning and teaching. It's not exclusively about technologies, but it is to think about how we might engage in enhancing what we do in our learning and teaching, and maybe, where appropriate, using technologies. That's really what it's about. It's not about throwing technology down your throat. And it's not about saying that technology is always the answer, far from it. There are many times when technology isn't the answer. But what we're trying to do is just open up ideas, open up ways of sharing technologies and people's experiences with them, good and bad, and that's where Room 101 comes in, I guess, and just to think about how we might employ some of these in our own teaching in the years to come. It is about a chance to talk to each other, as I say, because often we tend to do a lot of these teaching activities in isolation. We don't necessarily know what's going on. We don't necessarily know that other people have tried things, have learned, and have improved on things. So it's as much about sharing ideas as it is about hearing what's the latest and the latest technologies, etc. So do make the most of this opportunity to talk to your colleagues. And it is all about putting it within context of your own discipline. I think that's really important. It's not a case of one technology fits all or one application fits all. That really isn't the case. The technologies will only work appropriately if you put them in the context of your own discipline and your own type of teaching. Otherwise, the technology will drive the teaching, and that's not what we want. We want the teaching, the pedagogy to come first. The tool, the application, is the technology. So if we think of it in those terms, then hopefully that will work productively. I would like at this point just to thank Fazana and her team for drawing together TELFest. If I could say it, it would be even better. I do think it's a really important part, as I say, of the calendar of the year. It is part of the wider set of activities around teaching and learning, but Fazana and her team have done a great job in putting this all together, and what I think is a really interesting programme over the course of the week. So hopefully you can get engaged in some of those events, dip in and dip out as you see fit. The more you come, the more points you get, and you'll get. And we know what points make because we're playing game shows here. So please do that, and I'd like to thank everybody for their contributions, because there's over 40 presenters during the course of the week as well, so which is fantastic. So it's really good that people have got involved. So that's TELFest. So what are we doing now in 101? Well, we've got a panel of distinguished experts who are going to give a very quick pitch in 2 rounds, okay? And what they're going to try and do is get something in to room 101. Now, ultimately, this is going to be a collective decision. We're all part of this, but as with all things PVC, my word is final. So, we've got a distinguished panel either side of us here. So we've got Claire Beecroft from SHAR, who's, well, I won't say what you're going to talk about. You're going to talk about that in a minute. We've got Nick Reed-McLaren from engineering. We've got Miles Jones from psychology. And indeed, last but not least, Julia Davies from education. Now, it's their job to convince you of why their particular pet hate should go into room 101. So what I'd like you to do is to help me make my decision, and this is where the app comes in, of course. So you can tweet things to TELFest, the hashtag TELFest. I have the master thing in front of me, so as Twitter's tweets come in, I can see what's going on. Please, let's keep Brexit out of it, okay? Prefer to avoid that for the next hour. So I'll get those coming in. Sorry, just blown it, Nick, sorry. And at the end of each round, you'll have a chance to vote again. Okay, so you'll have a chance to vote, you'll have a chance to comment, and then we can see what goes in the room. Okay? Everybody happy with that? Okay. Nick, I think you drew the short straw, didn't you? You're first. Okay. So, Nick, I'm going to give you about 3 minutes or so to say what your ideas are. Just before you start, though, Nick, we have another little animation.
Okay, so I'm going to talk today about these clicker devices. Now, I'm sure most of you here will know already what I mean when I say clickers. But if you don't, you can see a picture of one up here. And they're these sorts of devices that you can use for interacting with the students during a lecture, for example. You can set them questions, and then they can press the button on the clicker to give an answer. So they're quite limited in what they can do. Obviously, they're suited for multiple choice questions, but the limitations are very real about them. You can't really ask complex questions and expect students to answer on a clicker device. And I think we've seen recently, sorry Wynne, there's not always a great idea to give people the chance to say what they think before they've had access to all of the facts. Or time to reflect on those facts. But despite all these limitations, they are, and particularly because of that in some circumstances, they are really pedagogically useful in some circumstances. I'll give you 2 very quick examples from my own teaching. The first time I ever used clickers was in a lecture course a few years ago. The students often got the questions wrong and were then able to revisit those particular learning points, and the students would then be repolled and would be asked the same questions again once we've recovered the material. And their answers would hopefully improve. Hopefully, much like a second referendum that we might have. The second example, buoyed by this early success, although there were a lot of technical problems, I decided to embed clickers into a second, bigger lecture course the following year. As I say, I had a lot of technical problems. If you use PowerPoint, things tend to go easier with clickers. But if you don't use PowerPoint, if you use Keynote, like I do, for example, on a Mac, at one point, the clicker software took control of my laptop for about 10 minutes and didn't give it back, which is not ideal in a 1-hour lecture. And I'm not exaggerating there. So the technical issues were really, really a big problem, but pedagogical advantages were so great that I thought, we'll go with this again. So I wandered up to Kix to pick up the clickers the night before my new big lecture, my biggest moment in teaching, if you like, and there weren't any clickers. And this was a big problem, as you can imagine. I then had to spend the night before the biggest lecture of my career stripping out all the interactive elements that I'd put in. And instead of focusing on enhancing the student's experience, I was actually then having to break the student experience, if you like, and revert back to a traditional didactic lecture, which wasn't really good. So, to sum up, for me, it comes down to reliability. And with clickers, although they can be useful, the reliability just isn't there in terms of both the technology and often the availability as well. So I prefer to go for more modern things like smartphone apps, which will be more available and more reliable in my experience.
Okay, thank you very much, Nick. Thank you. Okay, thank you. Like the way you sneak that in. Okay, Claire. Claire, you're up next. Sorry, I'm looking the wrong way, Julie. Claire, you got a microphone there, Claire? Great. Go for it, Claire.
The thing I wanted to put into Room 101 is classroom-based software that's designed around to replace things like the clickers we just heard about, that require the students to download an app onto their own devices in order to be able to provide the responses of various kinds. The reason why I think these should go into Room 101 is because we don't really need them anymore. There's lots of services that offer this kind of thing that have moved over to a situation where you just give the students a URL at the beginning of the session, they go to that website in their browser, and then they're able to submit their responses. If we ask them to download an app, there's lots of different app stores out there. Lots of these apps aren't available on all the different app stores, so some students can download them and some students can't. We have a very international cohort in SHAR, lots of students from African nations where they've still got Blackberries. Nobody writes educational apps for Blackberries, so that's them out of the water to begin with. If you ask students to install it in advance, generally they don't, and so you're waiting around at the beginning of the session. It just doesn't work. When you think of examples of how something like FutureLearn, a whole learning platform, has been designed around no app, you can just make everything work through a mobile web browser. You don't need students to be having to install apps anymore to do anything. Our learning technologists in SHAR have created loads of content that just works in a mobile web browser. And that means that almost every student can engage with it, because even those that don't have a smart device probably come with a laptop. And the web browser is just the universal, so you can just crack on, get moving really quickly. But I get really fed up of hearing about exciting new technologies, and it needs the students to install an app, because I just think, well, that's the end of that. It's kind of dead in the water for me from the very beginning. So no more students having to install apps. Enough. We can do it all in a web browser. We don't need apps.
Brilliant. Thank you, Claire. Thank you very much. So, next up should be Miles. Miles, go for it.
Okay, so my suggestion is what used to be called the symposiums, which you can see in front of you there, which are now called the smart screens. And these are almost universally found in every lecture theatre. And the idea is that you can put your PowerPoint, etc., to present your lecture, and then you can annotate it or draw over it with a pen. And why on earth would you want to put that in Room 101? I hear you say, because it sounds like a brilliant idea. Indeed it was when we first got these about 10 years ago. They were excellent and one of my favourite forms of teaching technology. However, somewhere along the line, perhaps it was Windows updating or some form of compatibility issue, but they no longer seem to work for love nor money. So at the moment the problems with them are when you go to put your pen onto the screen, there seems to be a bit of a lag between the pen and the cursor by about a couple of seconds in time and almost a couple of feet in distance. And it also has difficulty annotating on most software. In terms of PowerPoint, which obviously used to be the old favourite, it'll let you do it when you're not in presenter view, but when you put it into presenter view, it seems to stop you being allowed to do that. So these excellent pieces of technology seem to be rendered almost useless by some sort of update or compatibility issue, which is a common way that teaching technologies can go wrong.
Excellent. Thank you, Miles. Thank you. Next one is Julia.
Okay, so I'm going to talk about skeuomorphs. And in technology, skeuomorphs are often used to help people who are more familiar with old technology to feel comfortable with new technologies. So, for example, on a computer, we're told that we're we're writing on pages, that we can put them in folders, or that there is a bin on the desktop. Pages, bins, desktops and folders are symbols on our screens. We don't actually use them to write. And so these are technological skeuomorphs, which help us use old understandings for our new practices. Of course, I don't really mind that kind of thing, although I do consider electric candles to be rather naff, which are also examples of skeuomorphs. What I don't like is the kind of pedagogical skeuomorph, which some people call old wine in new bottles. Ironically, the pedagogical skeuomorph is where we use new technologies to enact old practices. We look like we're doing something new, but actually we're not. So we perpetually use interactive whiteboards, so-called, to display our words while we say them to our students. And we stand in front of them, droning on in the same old ways. We are often, I'm afraid, being very, very boring. So these processes do not invest in the new pedagogical possibilities of new technologies. I agree that we do now give more polished performances, but these are traditional practices. Recently, I came across a blogger who described the wonderful lessons she gave on blogging, and interestingly, no technology was used. She required her students to handwrite on paper and for other students to make comments by sticking post-it notes on each other's work. This, colleagues, is not using new technologies, and it's certainly not blogging. So what I would rather see is the use of technologies to allow learning become more interactive, to disrupt traditional pedagogies, and to hear our students' voices more, to get them using technologies to connect with the world, to create exciting content, and break down the boundaries of our classroom walls.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Excellent. As someone who, in his junior school, had to answer the phone for the headmistress, and it was one of those big Bakelite things, and I had to handle wheel like that to get the call through. I fully understand that. So now I can't use my smartphone, but never mind. Here we go. Okay, so that's the four presentations in the first round. So we've had a range of ideas there. Now let me get back to the running order. So it's now a chance for you to cast your votes. So what you have to think about here are the different things you've heard, and which of those do you think should really be in 101? Should it be sympodia? Should it be apps? Should it be skeuomorphs? Or indeed, should it be clickers? Just testing. Please cast your vote either at the .com TELFest or indeed through the app if you've now downloaded that. Okay, we're going to go into a second round in a minute once we've... There we go. And it looks like Claire. So Claire, with 36%, the classroom apps, is going into... Hang on, where's my symposium? Room 101. There we go. Interesting. It was close run thing though. Close run thing. Sorry, Nick, you're stuck with the clickers. Brilliant. Okay. So now let's go back to round two. So Claire's going to go into round two.
Okay. I'm going to start with an analogy for this one, but stay with me. On the 3rd of September 1967, Sweden moved from driving on the left to driving on the right. And that's a simple change, and yet, of course, it's quite a seismic one because it's a huge thing to facilitate. And it was a very controversial thing. A few years before, they had what's known as a referendum in Sweden, where 82% of people voted against changing from driving on the left to driving on the right. But the government let it sit for a few years, and then they brought it back onto the agenda, and they said, we're just doing this anyway. But it's a big change. People were worried there were going to be thousands of accidents, people were going to be killed, it was just too dangerous to do it. But there were lots of good reasons and lots of research that was showing that it would be good for their economy in terms of the kinds of cars that they manufactured, and that it would actually reduce the number of accidents. Because all around them in Scandinavia, people drove on the right, people moved between these countries, because it's the EU, they do that. And so it just made sense. They said, we've got to do this. But obviously you got to handle a big change like that, well, to keep it safe and to get everybody on board with it, when in reality the country is saying this is not what we want. So they threw a huge amount of money at it. They produced a leaflet that was sent to every house to let people know this is when the change is going to happen. They set a date for it and stuck with that. They saturated the media, the radio and the TV with public service broadcasts telling people this is when it's going to happen, this is how it's going to happen. They had a competition to write a pop song to promote the change of driving from the left to the right. It was won by a group called the Telstars with their song Keep on the Right Side, Svensson. Very catchy. Could have won Eurovision that year. And it went ahead on that day. Everybody moved to the right. They put thousands of traffic cops onto the roads on that day to facilitate it. And instead of the thousands of accidents and the people being killed, nobody was killed, nothing happened, and they moved this change forward. Which brings me to Turnitin. Now, I want to start by saying I don't want to put Turnitin.
Seamless.
I don't want to put Turnitin into Room 101 because I actually really like Turnitin. We've been using it in SHA for years and years now, so it's very normal to me. I think it's absolutely right that students submit electronically and that they get their feedback electronically. I was a part-time student once who had an office door closed on me at 2 minutes past 2 because I'd had to wait ages because my trammer broke down and I couldn't submit my work on paper. And they just wouldn't open the door because they were just like, no, it's 2 o'clock, you can't come in. So I think it's good that students can submit electronically, and I like Turnitin. But I think what it's done is it's radically changed the physical environment in which people do their marking. Once upon a time, you got handed, now I'm old enough to remember this quite easily, a pile of essays or whatever it was to mark, printed out, and like a lot of people, I would take those home, I'd probably do my marking there, in quiet on the sofa, using my pencil, and it's nice, or it makes a difficult, repetitive job as nice as it can be. You get your little pile of papers building up on your right-hand side, and you know that you're making some progress. So what I want to put into Room 101 is the desktop marking interface for Turnitin, because it's taken all that away and said marking is something you do sat at your desk like everything else with the UV glow of your screen, and it's horrible. And so I'm not surprised there's so much antipathy towards Turnitin, because marking that way isn't really nice. It doesn't put you in a good mood, and if you're not in a good mood, I don't think you'll give good feedback. I think instead we should all be using the Turnitin app on our iPads. I know we don't all have one yet, because that makes it so much better. You can sit on your sofa like you always used to. You can use the amazing speech-to-text recognition that Siri offers, so you don't have to type on your iPad. You can just speak all your feedback. This is how I do the vast majority of my feedback now. I use rubrics, I use voice feedback, I annotate work. I do it so much better because I've got an iPad now. I just happen to have one. So I think the university needs to make like the Swedes. They need to give us all an iPad. They need to produce the support so that we all know how we're using it. We need to commission the pop song, obviously, and give everyone this means of doing their electronic feedback, because I think we'd all give more feedback, we'd give better feedback, and there wouldn't be this kind of antipathy towards Turnitin that I know is quite prevalent. So that's it.
Thank you very much, Claire. Thank you. So we put apps in Room 1, and now we're having an app in Room... Is that right? Okay. Just checking. Okay. Excellent. Thank you very much. Thanks to the Swedes. Okay. So, Miles, looks like you're up next. There we go.
Okay, so my choice for round 2 is centrally managed computers. Because I think, I'm not sure who manages those.
Okay, I'll just move out
within
the room
the University of Sheffield. And so there's obviously lots of advantages to this, like having all your software there when you turn the machine on. However, I think I'm particularly biased against these because I usually teach at 9 o'clock in the morning, so therefore I'm the first person to turn the computer on in the lecture theatre. And often if the lecture theatre's got a slower computer, it can take over 10 or even 15 minutes for the computer to boot up. That's led me to start arriving into the lecture theatre about 8:30, then going off to Starbucks while the computer turns on. The further disadvantage of it, centrally managed machines, is you can't install any software yourself. And although you don't want to install vast amounts, sometimes the Java's not updated, so you can't play a YouTube video, and it doesn't allow you to update things like plugins for your browser, and all of a sudden even doing something as simple as showing a YouTube video seems to stop working in the middle of the lecture.
Okay, thank you very much. Very succinct. Other coffee stores are available other than Starbucks, I hasten to add, but thank you for that, Miles. Okay, so I think Julia, you're up next.
Okay, so I want to talk about teacher traps. We've seen a few of those today.
Yep, demonstrated. Yep.
So as lecturers, we get very wound up and emotional before teaching. Everything is timed to the minute, and we don't have a moment to spare because we are leading up at the end to the essential super duper interactive pedagogy-tastic finale, and we will need to have time for that. We give our all. There is something of ourselves in our lessons.
Teacher trap. Teacher trap.
We prepare mentally, and we have our laptops all prepped. We even dress nicely, but we look good and feel bad. Of course, we remember the wonderful data projector connector thingy, which we finally learned that we need, because obviously Apple needs the cash. But then we find ourselves somewhere like the Diamond. We enter the teaching room, and it looks like nothing we've ever seen before. It's Doctor Who's TARDIS, and we are expected to impromptu become Doctor Who. This cannot help our ADHD, which is, of course, about to teach hyperactivity disorder. We hyperventilate, and we don't know where to put our USBs. But we are professionals, we remember our training, and we approach the technology. We connect our laptops, but the data projector is stupid. It tells us no input detected. This is actually worse than unidentified item in the bagging because in Aldi it's all about the sprouts. Here it's about the rows of people witnessing failure and looking at their watches. So we frantically start pressing F8, F7, F3, F5, shift keys, and a host of other combinations. Actually, our holiday snaps start appearing. But thank heavens, the data projector is still not detecting the laptop, and time is always ticking against us. Helpful people, not technicians, plot round, jamming your shiny laptop, talking about mirrors, settings, modes, stuff like that, and you step back. So this is what I do not like. Technology which traps us. Tools that don't work in Windows or Macs. Data projector adapters, hidden computer settings, mice, that's right. And don't start me on how sound controls are hidden in 4 different places. The first 3 you find are actually on. The 4th place you don't actually find, but it will be off. So these are teacher traps, and it's all about our time running out.
Excellent. Thanks, Julia. Thank you very much. As Julia rightly identified, we've had 1 or 2 of those today already. Had an interesting one myself lecturing this term. I was lecturing in one lecture theatre in Dainton, and halfway through the lecture I started getting a chemistry lecture coming in through the PA system. So, and the students didn't recognise it. Had no idea they're still taking notes. That was an interesting one. So this is the last one. So Nick, here we go.
So I decided to aim low with my final point, which is lecture capture. Now I can't imagine, I think this is rolling out across all universities, or certainly most of the leading universities, that this from the September coming, we're going to blindly record all of the lectures that are given. And in Sheffield we're going to do this using Echo 360, I imagine. I can't imagine the sort of person that would give this decision. Is he still here? A visionary, a genius. I'm all for anything that improves support for our students in Sheffield, absolutely. But I don't think that lecture capture on its own is the way forward. I don't think it's the best solution. We've trialled the Echo 360 approach already in material science and engineering, where I've come from. And I think it's going to provide really useful data to medical practitioners that want to stop the spread of colds and coughs around campus. That's pretty much all we've heard on the videos. Lots of coughing, lots of people moving around and this kind of thing. The audio quality was terrible, and I think our students deserve better than that. I think they deserve a professional service where they're paying a lot of money to be here. Also, I use a lot of problem-based learning exercises in some of my lectures, as you've heard already, things like clickers. And these aren't going to make for good entertainment when it comes to 20 minutes of silence on a video and my teaching is being recorded. It does give a lot of strengths though. Obviously, if you're recording the lectures, the students can replay it later. They can check the English. They can move backwards and forwards. But one small confession. I once, and it was only once, it was only once, made a mistake in one of my lectures. I said the wrong thing. I knew the right word, but the wrong word came out. Imagine, if you like, the equivalent of saying 2 + 2 = 5. In the olden days, before we recorded lectures, we can get away with that sort of mistake because it's not written down in the notes. Now, what happens when a student comes back when they failed their exam and says, I want to make an appeal? Because at 12 minutes 38 seconds, Nick clearly did say 2 + 2 = 5. We won't have a leg to stand on, even if the student did get the question technically wrong. I do worry about that. For me personally, I'm in a fortunate position. I already have professional quality screencasts supporting all of my teaching. In some cases, I have full lecture courses that have been recorded at home in my dining room on a professional microphone. In some cases, it's just key point videos. And they offer the same service, better quality videos, better quality audio, and often I'm reading from notes on them, so there'll be better quality teaching as well. And I think that's the sort of approach that we should be taking forward in Sheffield. Wherever people have the time to put in that extra effort, rather than relying on this kind of lazy, easy lecture capture approach. And so that's why I want to put that into room 101.
Okay, thank you very much. Thanks, Nick. So again, we've had 4 presentations there. Interesting set. Centrally timetable computing. Yeah, again, I have some sympathy with that. By the starting up computers in rooms seems to take a while to get going. Trying to keep the students engaged at that point. Yeah, I can understand that, Miles. But equally, I'm not a huge fan of Starbucks, so I'm not so sure I want to put that one in. Claire, the Swedish experiment. No, the app. Sorry, the app. Yeah. I like the notion of that. That's certainly a way of putting the marking interface as opposed to the app, putting the interface into the 101. I understand that. Anything that will help our assessment of feedback is a good thing. Slightly concerned about colleagues marking in the bath, though, as a consequence, and dropping the entire lot into the bath and losing it. Yeah, exactly. Teacher traps. I've never fell into one of those, so I just don't know. As you've seen, a great deal of sympathy with that. I think there's a lot with the technology. Having done something similar with the sound, where nothing happening, pressing every button, and then pressing the right button, having put the volume up to 11, you know, all the students then screaming because of the pain of the ears. So I fully sympathise with that. But I guess no process is foolproof, so can we ever make them foolproof? Don't know. And then lecture capture. That's an interesting one, Nick. Highly topical. So topical in your first subject, topical in the second. It's good to see. Yeah, I understand the laziness. I get that. I understand the quality. I think if we're going to do this, we're going to do it right. Having captured for about 6 years now, I know the value to the student. Just even of rough and ready stuff. They don't watch them all. They watch, for 2 minutes, they watch the tricky bits, and it's helpful to me to know what that is. So it's a difficult one. But so it's 4 really compelling cases there. So hopefully you're feeding through. Let me just see what's coming up on the Twitter. Let's see what the feeling is. Can they all go to 101? Yeah, my echo is not good enough. Love the teacher traps. Does that mean you love putting them in place, or just love the teacher traps? Okay, and this is the result. And it's still changing, but at the moment, yep, Julia's teacher traps has swept the board with 48%. What an appropriate number. I think we've seen that before sometime this week. Oh, look at it, look at it. We want to recount. Oh. My goodness, can we hit the 50? Can we get them up? Fantastic.
Can I do this?
Yeah, of course you can. Yeah. When you say you were going to get rid of these teacher traps, what you meant was you weren't going to get rid of these teacher traps at all. Brilliant. Oh, there you go. You made it. Yeah. Brilliant. Yeah. The youngsters didn't show. That was the problem. Okay. Listen. Hopefully you've enjoyed that. Bit of fun. Bit different. And what what I'd like to say is that that's at the heart of what we're trying to do with TELFest. It is about reflecting on experience, and I think that's really important. It is about reflecting that technology isn't always the answer, the point I made earlier, and that we have to ask the question, which I was joshing with Nick, but it's the right point. What are we doing when we do certain things with the technology? What is it that lecture capture means, for example? What do we want to do for our students as a consequence of engaging with that technology? Not simply that we must do it, but why? And I think that's a really important part of the discussion, and that's why we're not actually fully implementing lecture capture from September. We're going to work on it more, but there's lots of colleagues that we haven't engaged with yet, and we need to do that. And we need to think about how it's not simply capturing lectures, it's about how we use to use the old-fashioned phrase, video or rich media to support student learning. And that might be 5-minute bits of lecture rather than 50-minute blocks. That might be a better use of technology. It might be a mix of the two, some talking, some interaction, etc. So we need to think about these things. We need to think about how do we change our working practices? How do we mark online in an effective way that actually is, as you say, it's time-saving, it actually feels more productive, puts you in a better mood, which is always good when it comes to marking. How can we harness existing technologies to support what we want to do as academics? Because that's really important as well. It's not simply about doing more and more and more. It's about doing things differently. I think that's an important part of it as well. Yes, the support around this is also very important. The traps and the centrally timetabled computers. We need to make sure that as a university we give all our academic colleagues and our students the right experience when it comes to these technologies. It's never going to be, but it needs to feel pretty seamless. Okay, we don't want it to be clunky. We don't want it to be an effort. We want it to be relatively straightforward. And as much as we can do that, that's what we're trying to do. But the more we get feedback on these things, the more we can get input about the speed of machines, about the technology working or not, the clarity of these positions, these things, these desks, and how they work for us is really important. If we don't hear about it, we won't know. So we do need to keep that flow of information going, because ultimately it's about us using the technology for our students. And I think that's what it's got to be all about. But hopefully that was a bit of fun. I wouldn't disagree with the two winners in terms of round 1 and round 2. I think there's a lot of merit in all the cases that were made there, and I think that goes to prove again that this is not a black and white area. It's not yes or no. Can't escape the damn thing, can we? It's not about that. It's about shades of grey, and I think that's really important as well. So thank you very much for your input and for your exercising your franchise during the voting thing. That's really good. And hopefully you'll engage with the rest of the week as you go on, and hopefully you'll have fun as well. So I'd like to thank our 4 speakers who did a cracking job, I thought. Can we thank them, please?